I'm the kind of urban nerd who's gonna get up on a Saturday morning, make sure there's air in my bike tires, and be like, what new path will I explore? Which new commuter? I am weird. That is not the American norm. I mean, I think this bubble thinks that's normal. It's not normal outside this room. So there is this question of what kind of programming attracts someone that first time, that gives them that experience. You know, is it having the BSO in Franklin Park, or is it having the Puerto Rican Festival on City Hall Plaza? Is it the really amazing work of the, we did that Open Streets event and had a great name, and we did it on Blue Hill Avenue. Circle the City. I'm like, I worked on it so hard. Like, Circle the City was great. You know, the difference between doing it on Huntington Avenue versus doing it on the Greenway versus doing it on Blue Hill Avenue, you invite people out to try something that is outside of their comfort zone, and then suddenly they say, oh,
they think about their city or their neighborhood in a new way, yeah, and they think about their boundaries in a new way, yeah.
Matthew Kiefer is a land use attorney at the law firm of Goulston and Storrs, focusing on obtaining site control and development approvals from public agencies for complex urban projects. His experience extends to market-oriented and affordable housing, commercial and mixed-use developments, as well as facilities and master plans for healthcare, educational, cultural, and other nonprofit institutions. Matt also assists clients in the creation of public-private partnerships for open space and is active in land use planning and policy and historic preservation. He's a member of the City of Boston's Community Preservation Committee and is the immediate past chair and continuing member of the Executive Committee of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. Matt is also the co-chair of Goulston and Storrs' Green Business Practice and its Climate Resilience Task Force. He has taught in the urban planning and real estate programs at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and at MIT, and has written and spoken extensively on real estate and land use, law, and policy. All such complex stuff. But I think this panel will help unpack some of that. So who better to moderate a panel about Boston's Greenway Network? Please help me welcome Matt Kiefer.
I have to say it's a little daunting. It's exhilarating to be this generation. It's also a little daunting because we really want to get it right. We're doing some things that are going to last for a long time, and they're going to affect a lot of people. So with that, I want to turn to our speakers, introduce them for a minute. Their longer bios are in your program, so I'm not going to repeat everything about them, but I want to tell you a little bit about each of them that I think sort of informs their perspective on this subject. And I think you'll see why they are heirs to this tradition of citizen activists who care about our city and making it better and finding new ways of making the case for how to do that. So in alphabetical order, Alice. Alice Brown, wave your hand. Yeah, there we go. Is the Director of Water Transportation at Boston Harbor now. Her current focus. She was previously involved in Go Boston 2030, a much broader frame of reference on transportation, the city's future transportation. And a little known fact, Alice spent a summer, not too many years ago, mapping the Emerald Network and walking and biking every mile of the 200 miles of the Emerald Network. So she has an on-the-ground knowledge, a ground truth about this as a result of that I think you'll see. Tamika Francis is the Community Engagement Manager at Let's Get Healthy Boston, which is a collaboration between the Boston Public Health Commission and the Boston Alliance for Community Health. She was a key architect of that organization's Healthy Community Champions program, has a background in public health and sort of at the intersection of public health and physical space and community engagement. Tamika's also, she's of Caribbean heritage, born in Jamaica, and has spent some time in the islands and has worked in a broad range of diverse communities, maybe even plus a level of diversity that not many bring to this effort. Alex Krieger, you can probably guess which one is Alex if you don't already know him. Is a principal in the Boston office of the international design firm NBBJ, and also a professor at the GSD, where he's taught all kinds of things over the years, but in particular some recent planning studios that have been focused on open space. And he's been a board member and advisor to the Map Center as well as to the Emerald Network, really from the very beginning. And also, little known fact, author of a great book that is not as widely read anymore as it used to be, called Past Futures, which is about sort of the history of planning ideas in Boston and how they've shaped Boston over time. Is that still in print, Alex?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. And Jessica Robertson, to my left, is a senior planner at Utile. Jessica is currently the project manager for Envision Cambridge, a comprehensive planning effort now underway in Cambridge, and was the community engagement manager for Imagine Boston 2030, the City of Boston's comprehensive plan, which, if you don't know, had an extensive community engagement process as part of it, really kind of took that to a new level. She previously worked in transportation at MAPC and is a biker and bike advocate and founder of a bike collective in Allston, and very involved in the I-90 interchange task force in Allston. So our format is just going to be a series of questions. We have some slides behind us, and for those of you on social media, you'll see our handles and hashtags on the slide here, and encourage you to tweet if you're so moved. And some of these slides will scroll behind us. We'll also, some of the speakers may refer to them as we, as we hit topics that are depicted in these slides. And we're going to save plenty of time for audience questions. So how many people were outside today? It's a great day to be alive in Boston, isn't it? So I think we've all witnessed what I was saying earlier, that our city's changing before our very eyes. And, as I said earlier, we sort of want to get this right. So one of the, hopefully, advantages we have in that effort is planning, having done some planning maybe for the first time in a while. Jess, you've been involved in a lot of that. So how much does open space figure in that planning? How important is it among all the things you're thinking about?
So planning definitely, open space is definitely a factor in the recent citywide comprehensive planning that's been going on in both Boston and Cambridge. And I think it's very relevant to the discussion tonight because in, cities like Boston and Cambridge, they're pretty built out. So there isn't a whole lot of space to be planning, a giant new park without tearing down something that's already there. So really the most important issues that these plans have been looking at in the context of open space is connectivity and how we can do smaller interventions or more linear interventions that can bring the parks more in reach of people in different neighborhoods and make them more accessible, and how we can program open space differently to attract different people to come, and how we can really make sure that open space is accessible to all, both in terms of how you get there, whether, using any of the different transportation modes, but also feels welcoming to all different kinds of people, and that there's many different kinds of open space that can be used in different ways. So it's really about having a network, along with the Emerald Network concept, that if you're in any part of one of these cities, you can feel like you can access the open spaces that we already have, because we already have some really incredible open spaces like the Emerald Network, the Charles River, the Harbor, and Franklin Park. And so it's really about getting people to them and making sure they're welcoming for everyone.
Right. So I want to pick up on a couple of ideas there. And you'll see the Emerald Network map behind you. This is a very simple concept. It's a 200-mile network of greenways in Boston and its inner suburbs that connect people to places, to open space, to jobs, to school. Several of those greenways, as Jessica was saying, already exist. We have a pretty rich legacy already. So the idea of the network is to connect them, is to provide the missing links, which is one of the concepts you mentioned in this planning effort. I want to, and you also said the word network. Alice, having been sort of involved from the beginning here, and on this theme of the new ways people use open space, just mentioned several ideas there. Is connectivity, is it an exaggeration to say it's sort of a new organizing principle for open space planning? Are we fooling ourselves to think that, or is that sort of emerging as a?
I think it's a great concept. Can people hear me? Great. I love the idea of connectivity, both the idea of intramodal connectivity, so if you're on a bike or you're walking, what does it feel to be connected? But then intermodal connectivity. So in my current role, I'm advocating for and hoping to improve water transportation in Greater Boston. Obviously, once you hit a body of land, you cannot take the ferry any farther. But what is that experience when you get off? Are you automatically part of a bike network, or is there a bus waiting for you? So how do those intermodal connections happen? But there's all these clues that the built environment provides you to say that this is the appropriate connection. If you've recently biked through Kendall Square, and there was a route that I took for years that I thought I was the only person who took, and then they designed it to show me that I wasn't the only one, that when you're coming down through past the T station, there's this funny little jog before you get to the Longfellow Bridge, and you can kind of sneak past the kayak rental and take this little canal bridge, and then there's a secret light that helps you cross over Memorial Drive. It's the most bizarre and wonderful thing. So you discover that there's connectivity for you, and there's a communication that says this is for you, that connectivity isn't just, of course, the car can keep going, but what are those clues? Whether it's in a park and you're on a path and you say, oh yes, the path is continuing, not fading off into the wood, or you're on a bike network, or anywhere. Where is that connectivity telling you it's okay?
I want to come back to the network idea, but before we do, Tamika, question for you, and particularly about this intersection of, one of the points others are making is really open space is being used more actively. It's not just a passive refuge from the city. You've been involved in the sort of the connection between public health outcomes and the way people use physical space. It seems that that's more and more in the air. That connection is no longer a subject just of academic study. Do you share that impression that this is now, and if that's true, that public health advocates are more alert to this, are they getting more involved in planning efforts? Are they tuned into urban planning in a new way?
So this works. So a little bit of a shameless plug. On my way here, I stopped at the Summer Fitness Series launch in Copley Square. It's a partnership between the Boston Public Health Commission and the Boston Parks and Recreation Department. And it's a series of summer activities, Zumba, yoga, different physical activities that are hosted in different parks, including Franklin Park and a bunch of others. So I know the commission, at least in the public health sector here, is very keyed in. I think we're a little bit behind still on making that very direct connection in terms of the planning portion. In health and housing, there is an intersection there, but in terms of future thinking or being forward about how you plan spaces for active lifestyle, I think we're still learning to intersect both the health sphere and also the planning sphere. So those historically have been two distinctly different groups. And I think activism and community and residents have been asking for more interurban spaces and using these spaces in ways that weren't imagined, and that now influences how they're being designed further.
That's a great segue. Alex, thanks for your patience.
I assumed the next question was going to be to me, right?
Yeah, good guess. Tamika talked about using space in new ways. So back to Olmsted for a minute, sort of the frame for this panel. He was a pretty clever guy in his day, pretty forward-thinking. How much of this would be a surprise to him? Are these challenges, new versions of challenges he sort of thought about, or is this really a new world we're in of open space planning?
You must think I look old enough to be a contemporary of his. So yes, my pal, Fred. It's a complicated question because the immediate answer would be no, it's different, although there's certainly some parallels. So let me say three things. One is, he did not like cities. Let's remember that. He actually redesigned some of our first suburban areas around the country. He thought the city, at least his city, right, or his cities, were polluted, were congested, were inhumane. And one of the reasons why he wanted to return nature to them was to make them a little bit more livable. So that's very important to understand. Unlike us, or perhaps the audience, he was not a great lover of the city of his day. Secondly, he came from a social reform background, some of you might know. park design was his second career. And as a social reformer and really part of an elite class in Boston, he was in New York, he was very concerned about the underclass, as he would call it, and the growing number of immigrants and uneducated and rural immigration. And he was worried about them. And he was worried about them in two ways. He was worried about them, of course, about their welfare. He was also worried about challenging conventions and challenging, in fact, his class. And so a slightly less often discussed aspect of the social reform movement is to kind of make them into better citizens by occupying public spaces with others and to kind of socialize the newcomers. But the third thing is, so I'm not sure that those two things are the same, but the third thing that one has to remember is that park building was the basis for urban planning at the end of the 19th century. Olmsted was brought to Boston first not to design a park, but to solve a sewage problem that began by filling in the back bay and therefore putting all the, I can't say the four-letter word, up into the muddy river. And he had to solve that first, and he realized he could solve that through an open space network. And in fact, during the end of the 19th century, park building was the mechanism of planning. Park building was the way to clean the air. Park building was the way to solve sewage. Park building was the way to order transportation. We have to remember all the kind of boulevards and arteries that were part of, by the way, he was a great connector. That part is not so new. Park building was a way to kind of organize where development would go. Park building actually was an early form of urban renewal, of cleaning up some kind of slums and so forth. And the best example of that, and I'll finish, I promise, the best example of that is actually not in Boston or in Olmsted. It was actually go to Kansas City between about 1895 and 1915. The most amazing park system was created. And it didn't start with the Common or a public garden. It had no such thing, or Commonwealth Avenue. But it was a way to organize a rapidly growing city, and again, to improve sewage, transportation, open space, the direction of development, overcoming topographic challenges, and so forth. And so Olmsted was not a mere park builder. Olmsted was an urban planner. And in that way, I think things are not so different. And that is, I think that the way we should think about open space today is as a form of planning to improve the city, which is, of course, what the challenge to them certainly was.
Right, yeah. Interesting. So let me follow up on a piece of that. So, he was planning the industrial city,
yes.
The growing industrializing city, emerging city, new residents, immigrants, socializing immigrants.
Yeah.
He talked about it in ways we might find a little paternalistic today, but in
Absolutely.
fact, we certainly would find paternalistic today, but in his day, he saw open space as sort of democratizing.
Absolutely,
so,
right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're now in a built city. It's not done, but it's built. It's not expanding, or at least the geography we're talking about is now expanding, and it's not industrial anymore, or not much. Is that part of why we have this opportunity now to use open space more actively? That we're no longer, we have an economy that's driven mostly by knowledge industries and by hospitals and universities, and we have stricter environmental laws, limits on air emissions, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a connection between that? Why is it that people are using open space so much more actively? Is it because our city's different? Is it because society's different? I'm asking a really open-ended question of each of you.
I think if I was answering this question in a national context, I would just take off from where you were right now and say, yes, we have this leftover industrial space, we have unused rail corridors, we have these sort of lingering pieces that can all be knit together pretty effectively. If you look at Atlanta and their belt lining, that's a great example of that. I think in Boston, it's not as clear which leftover spaces are really available, particularly for parks. You know, Tamika mentioned the crisis of housing and how that's intersecting with health and how we're trying to address that as planners and as health people. I don't think yet we're in a place where we're saying every time you find a vacant industrial space, open space is the solution. I don't think that's winning the argument in Boston.
I would answer it slightly different. I mean, I don't disagree, but I think that we still, in some ways, it is not so different. We may not be worried about terribly polluted air, but cities are constraining. Cities are difficult, even as we may love them more now. Cities are taxing on your on your sort of energies. And so the notion of finding time, and we, in some ways, we have more time than the factory worker back in the 1880s. We enjoy, just as in Olmsted's day, we enjoy kind of getting away from the rasping frictions of daily life. And open space, whether it's for recreational purposes or other purposes, still provides that. So in that sense, I'm not sure it's so different, although more of us may actually be able to take more advantage of it today for a variety of different reasons than perhaps folks at the end of the 19th century.
Jess, I want to ask you a bit about bikes. I know this is about more than bikes, and I don't want to typecast you as you touch this issue more broadly than this, but you are an avid biker. So another emerging, this is something new about our city, a challenge Olmsted, to my knowledge, didn't really have to think about much. So do you bike for fun, for commuting, when you think about biking, when you think about whether the way the city is configured works for you and your biking habits, is it about leisure? Is it about travel? Is it about all of the above?
So I actually think that back to the public health theme a little bit, the interesting thing to me is that open space has always been about public health. It's just that the public health issue we're trying to address has changed. And so originally it was, sewage, and now it's, the last 10 or 15 years, it's been about, physical activity. But I think the next wave is actually going to be psychological health and sort of a more well-rounded idea of wellness. And there's research that I'm sure Tamika can speak more intelligently about than I can, about how being in nature has really huge psychological impacts.
It actually affects health outcomes, yeah.
Absolutely. And so I consider myself extremely lucky because my commute is in nature. I bike on the Esplanade all the way from Lower Allston into downtown twice a day. And I absolutely feel that impact on my own personal health and well-being. There was a winter a couple years ago when DCR closed the little boardwalk that goes under the BU Bridge for a few months. And so I had to take the streets, and I was way more stressed out that winter. And then they opened the bridge back up, and I got my river commute back, and I was, much happier. So I think it's the goal is to not have recreation and exercise be things that we go to a place and do at a specific time, but
it's just part of your life.
For it to be woven into the way we live every day of our lives. And so that's something that I'm very lucky to be able to do every day. And I think that's the goal of things like the Emerald Network, to make that accessible to more people. So you can not just say, I'm going to go to the park today, but the park is actually the easiest way for me to get to wherever I'm going.
Yeah, Tamika, I was going to, but go ahead. I had a question for you anyway. Maybe you'll cover it.
So what Jessica mentioned, in public health interventions, we know that individual interventions to each person is less effective than changing the context. So changing the space and making the healthy choice the default choice. But going back to Alex's point, what we do know, applaud Olmsted, but taking it back to the current era, is that immigrants and newcomers and folks then weren't part of the process, and there were assumptions about how they were and who they were. So I think the opportunity here is to recognize both the public health perspective, making the healthy space a default space. It's a space you choose by the river Esplanade is your option because your neighborhood looks that way. But in many contexts where immigrants had poorer neighborhoods, red line and several options, it limited how many open spaces they had available to them. Yeah. So I think there's a reconciliation that needs to happen to think through how these spaces were built, who was allowed to use them, and even how you thought of the people who were using the spaces. It was a gift versus recognizing it as a right. So thinking through those pieces are important going forward.
Yeah, there are a couple things there I want to follow up on. Go ahead, Alex. On this, I want to stay on this for a minute.
Yes, so actually on both points made, we're involved in a number of healthcare projects. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was assumed that a sick person in a hospital had to lie in a darkened room. All of a sudden, hospitals want to make as large windows as possible in patient rooms because there's actually proven evidence that people recuperate quicker when they look out.
Even better if they have views of trees,
of
right?
Of course, yeah.
So, Tamika, you've done a lot of community engagement around this connection between sort of the way of physical infrastructure, big term, and public health. How do you communicate? How do you break that down in a non-jargon way? How do you communicate that message in a way that reaches people?
You don't. I say you don't because I'll go back to the project I worked on a few months ago, Let's Get Healthy Boston. We had imagined, or we were asked by the CDC, the mandate was to work on physical activity. Our residents were the ones who came to us with the Fairmont Greenway being the space that was in their backyard, the space that connected Mattapan all the way down to Upham's Corner area. And for them, when it wasn't written in our project, that was the space. So you may not have had the technical language, but folks knew that the Greenway, the parks and spaces that connected them from one neighborhood to the rest of their community is a space that we should have had an intervention. So I think this top-down approach is how we usually think about it, but I think as folks come to you with information and come to you with ideas and concepts of what works best for them, then can you say retranslate? You take it back to them in a way that's approachable and also makes more sense for them. Because many times folks are in survival mode, but they do know what's best for the neighborhoods. I think our job as public health officials is to then meet them where they are and then translate this idea of default context and healthy context into what works for that neighborhood at the time.
Right, yeah. You use the word connectivity again. So this concept that we're sort of circling around here is this notion that we're using the city more actively in non-motorized ways. I guess that's the kind of premise, right? People have, a lot of this is people moving through the city or on foot, on bikes, on whatever, other non-motorized, pushing the baby stroller or whatever it might be. A lot of people think of, what I'm getting to is how large the frame of reference is of most residents. A lot of people think of their neighborhood. They know their route to school, to take their kid to school. They know how to get to the closest T-stop. Jessica, you know how to get to work. Who's receptive to this? And yet we also know that when you frame each of those pieces as part of a network, it's much more powerful idea that you can get anywhere. This is not just about letting people in this particular community get to that particular park. It's a comprehensive idea. How do you communicate that? Who's the receptive audience for that idea of network value, let's call it? Alex, start with you on that. So how would you, who do you need to reach about the larger concept that underlies this in order to start thinking about it more than just how I get to school or how I get to work?
I'm not sure you're calling the right person because I think that networking is over-promised by people like us. But in a neighborhood, I think that they'd be much more interested in making sure that they have something for themselves. I actually want to switch back to Olmsted, but for a second, but not unrelated.
No, sure.
And I would like to have the Columbia Road map shown. There's a piece of the necklace which was never completed. Actually, my wife up there, Ann, and I wrote a Globe editorial in 1988 saying, gee, do this, right? It was only 80 years after the fact. It's now 100 years after the fact. So there's a 2-mile-long piece that was supposed to be like the Arbor Way, like the J-Way, to connect Franklin Park to actually the harbor. Therefore, the necklace would be complete, water to water, right? There's movement amongst us in the city, and Boston 2030 identified that as an issue and so forth. But I think the people along that route may not necessarily think of it as a completion of a network as much as a better sidewalk, more greenery, a wider path. Maybe some would think about stormwater. Certainly they would think about safer places than currently exist along Columbia Road for getting to school and so forth. So I think that people talking about network is important. Olmsted says, what was the Emerald Necklace but a network? Right? We're just expanding it. But I think that you might have to think differently about extolling networks when you talk to a neighborhood. I'm not sure we would get very far when we go to all those neighborhoods in sort of that Dorchester and talk about completing the Emerald Necklace. That may not be the quickest way to their affection than by talking about some of the things that they most require now relative to open space, mobility, and so forth.
Yeah, easier way to get to,
Yes.
yeah.
The result would be a great network, maybe, after we finish 36 beautiful little improvements throughout the city.
Yeah, there you go.
The network will emerge.
I think this is the role of a transportation planner, is to think about
Of course.
the need for a network when the individual citizen will not. So we did a really great event with Go Boston 2030 where we had people come together and you couldn't sit with someone who lived in your neighborhood. So the idea was that you would talk about your transportation needs with people who were theoretically unlike you, and then you also had little personas you had to follow off of. And in doing so, people understood that their unique experience was not the universal experience. Not everyone who lives in Roslindale relies on Washington Street, or even not everyone who relies on Washington Street relies on it in the same way. It's very different to have biked to the event than to have taken the bus and gotten stuck in traffic versus to be driving and stuck in traffic, or opted to take the commuter rail because you wanted to avoid being stuck in traffic. So each time people hear about their needs, they understand that a whole network is needed to support it. And I think it's interesting in water transportation too, we're trying to solve a transportation problem that is more than just, wouldn't it be nice if someday I could take the boat from X to Y, but understanding how many people on a daily basis need to get from X to Y. Is there sufficient demand to put a whole boat with a whole schedule out there operating that service? And similarly, like someone in Kendall Square figured out that you needed this weird little, the bike lane literally does this on the around bollards and cones. It's not even a real bike lane, but someone saw that connection was important to enough people's network that they needed to design for it. And so I think that's our role, is to come in and say, this is a network that someone's going to go from here to here and someone's going to go from here to here, but the network is needed to solve everyone's problem.
I agree with that, and I wasn't arguing against that at all. It may not, and it's important, it may not be the quickest way to the heart of a citizen. Right.
Absolutely.
It depends on your audience a little bit.
Right. Yes, right, yeah.
I was going to share an actual story of quick ways to hearts. So when we started this project that we worked on, so active transit was a work area, and many of our folks from residents, around 70 residents from Boston, 7 different neighborhoods. Transit, biking was just not what they were thinking of. Most folks were drivers. It took us around 2.5 years of learning. And learning means not a patriarchal, but really sitting down to understand what matters to you. So it's the us, the we, it's the me, it's the us, and it's the we. So folks were able to share out and teach. So we had those same or similar cross-neighborhood alliances. So we had a team from Mattapan in South Boston go over to Allston when the People's Pike was being debated. Not because it was our issue, but because we understood if that happened, there was space for other projects like that to happen elsewhere. So the idea is, the affection has to go through information. There's some around attitudes and practices, and really doing with versus for. I think we've seen over time that folks are more willing to open up when they're learning along the way, and they're being seen as almost amateur experts, if that can make sense. So folks are learning along the way, and they in turn share with their neighbors as well. But seeing the us and the we versus, and also the personal stake is important.
Tony, can you go back to the Columbia Road slide?
The plan.
Or actually maybe the networks, we don't have a slide of existing greenways, but maybe the network slide, a little bit to this point that if you map greenways and parks in the city today, it's also true of transit, that we have a great legacy of the Esplanade, the Emerald Necklace, emerging greenways on the Mystic River, the Neponset River, the Harbor Walk. Those assets are not evenly distributed. There's a whole swath of the center of the city, which happens to be mostly low-income communities of color, that's not well served by open space or transit.
Or other things as well.
Oh, a lot of other things as well. That's true. So, you know, I think of John Barros, the chief of economic development in the city of Boston, tells the story of growing up in Roxbury and not knowing there was a river in Boston. He'd never been to the Esplanade as a kid. He grew up near Dudley, 2 miles away, 3 miles away, something like that. There are sort of invisible barriers that we don't necessarily think about that much. Is open space, is a network, are these connections, when we talk about connections, you know, it's one thing to have a route to bike to work. Is this a way to try to redress those inequities? Can you connect people more broadly to the rest of the city by the right kinds of interventions like Columbia Road? Are we putting too much stress on a project like that to think we could do that?
So I think that actually this is one of the places where networks in particular are very important, because if you are a kid growing up in Roxbury and you know, are riding your bike with your friends on a summer day and there's a bike path somewhere in your neighborhood, you will ride on that bike path, but then it ends and you'll turn around and go home. But if that bike path connects to another bike path seamlessly, that connects to another bike path seamlessly, that ends at the river, there's a much better chance you're going to know there's a river. And so, you know, we've seen this in, you mentioned the bike collective that I'm involved with in Alston, and we do a lot of programs with low-income kids who live in the neighborhood, and some of them live literally across the street from the river and really don't get there very often. And so it's incredible how even the smallest gaps in a network can really become that barrier. But if you can make that seamless infrastructure, like Tamika and Alice were both talking about, where continuing it is the default, and it makes it obvious what you're supposed to do and where you're supposed to go next in order to stay in that network, then it's much easier to explore. And, you know, and so many kids in the city, even if they're low income, do have bikes and will, you know, get out and explore, and they just, you know, they end up being confined by infrastructure barriers, you know, by major roadways or train tracks or other things that make it, you know, make you turn around and go back the other way.
I'm usually an optimist. I promise you, I'm optimistic. But I think an invisible barrier is also permission. So historically, folks have not had permission to go to certain spaces. So I think in the process that Go 2030 did, it gave permission for folks to think outside their own neighborhoods and think outside their own selves. So I think that's also important, that in addition to the physical barriers, we remember that there are unspoken invisible barriers that we need to work through community-wide processes and conversations, and also just inclusion, having folks have a seat at the table to say, how have you experienced Franklin Park in the last 30 years? There is investment now, but I didn't grow up here in Boston or in the US for that matter, but I do have heard the stories of that park looking differently several years ago. So there's still this invisible structure that sits where folks are not willing to explore some spaces because they weren't allowed to. So I think that needs to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, and it's a magnetism question with public space. So I'm the kind of urban nerd who's gonna get up on a Saturday morning, make sure there's air in my bike tires, and be like, what new path will I explore? Which new commuter? I am weird. That is not the American norm. I mean, I think this bubble thinks that's normal. It's not normal outside this room. So there is this question of what kind of programming attracts someone that first time, that gives them that experience. You know, is it having the BSO in Franklin Park, or is it having the Puerto Rican Festival on City Hall Plaza? Is it the really amazing work of the, we did that Open Streets event and had a great name, and we did it on Blue Hill Avenue. Circle the City. I'm like, I worked on it so hard. Like, Circle the City was great. You know, the difference between doing it on Huntington Avenue versus doing it on the Greenway versus doing it on Blue Hill Avenue, you invite people out to try something that is outside of their comfort zone, and then suddenly they say, oh,
They think about their city or their neighborhood in a new way, yeah, and they think about their boundaries in a new way, yeah. Yeah.
So can I expand upon that a little bit? Because I think that the issue of permission is very important, right? I'm not sure that we are thinking radically enough or intelligently enough about overcoming that permission boundaries. And I want to raise actually the example of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Now, it is next to one of the most expensive, housing area, and it overlooks Manhattan. And there's a small part of it that is pastoral and Olmstedian-like. And then there's a mile of basketball courts and athletic fields and picnic areas and children's play areas. And all of a sudden what you see is people from all over greater New York getting out to the harbor, understanding that there's a harbor, just like there might be a river. And for example, all along our vaunted innovation district, we're not thinking well enough about how to invite the rest of the city to it.
We have these,
and part of that has to do exactly
with these panels of lawn in front of office buildings.
It's not the way to do it.
Not always lawn.
Yes. And so that's a challenge that is different than linking greenways, and an equally important one for our city. Yeah.
Tony, can you go to the Casey overpass slide? So I want to pivot a little bit to how we can get more of these done. We're talking about another theme that's emerged from this conversation is this phrase is increasingly used now of co-benefits. Tony, you have that slide of the Emerald Network, the icons with the benefits of the Emerald Network. When we
This
talk.
is the Casey Arborway.
What's that? Yeah, no, I asked about Casey overpass there. So, when we've talked about the Emerald Network, we certainly talk about it that way, that it's a project that deserves, it's an initiative that deserves public support and public funding, because many of these links are going to be built in public rights-of-way. There may be some limited opportunities for private initiative, but it's mostly public. That you can make the case better when you have multiple benefits, and in fact, this does. We've talked about the public health benefits, the quality of life benefits, the healthy, the environmental health in addition to public health, equity and opportunity, mobility in an increasingly congested city. The ones that have happened have been opportunistic, and that's why I was talking about Casey, Tony. Casey Overpass is for those of you who don't know, overpass built in the 1930s along the Emerald Necklace in Jamaica Plain at Forest Hills that was failing and needed to be replaced. And the question was, do you replace it with an overpass or with a surface solution that can reconnect a piece, two jewels in the Emerald Necklace that were kind of severed, the Arboretum and Franklin Park, when the overpass was built. And there was a big debate about whether that was a good idea. It just so happened, as those Jamaica Plain residents in the audience, and I see a couple of them there are nodding their heads, Sarah definitely remembers this. It was a year plus, 2-year debate. Anne was involved in it about whether it really made sense to replace the overpass that was there or to use this as an opportunity to think differently. And in the end, and it was helpful that the surface solution was cheaper. The surface solution was chosen and is almost done. It's like an inch away from being done. They're planting these spindly trees right now as we speak, which hopefully they'll water and they'll grow to maturity. So long question. Have you been there? And is it as transform? Does it? Did we get it right? Did that project strike the appropriate balance? And is it a model for others? We're going to come to the People's Pike in a minute. The appropriate balance between automobility, which is still a need in our city, and that has a decent sort of traffic count, between automobility and let's call them greenway values. Did we get that right? What do you think, Alex? You experience it frequently.
Often, yeah. I don't think we'll know for a generation at least. Right now it looks awful. It looks like there's too many lanes and the trees are ridiculously small and there's not enough of them. And so I don't think that it has been sort of taken over by other uses that would make it seem much more. Now, it was the right decision. I think it was the right decision. Actually, I'm not sure my wife agrees, but that's okay. Right decision. But I don't think we'll know because it has not yet transformed from being a big roadway to a boulevard, a greenway
Yeah.
yet. Now, if people start using it that way over time, it will have sort of met the challenge.
And I suppose you could plant more trees.
You could,
right?
I hope that they do.
Yeah.
I think we should restore Arbor Day just for the Casey overpass, right? Yeah, right.
Alice, did you have something you were going to say there? No?
I think some of the automobile drivers in my life, for some reason, associated the fact that I sometimes mostly ride a bike with the fact that this happened as it was my fault. Like I somehow caused it, even though I don't live in JP and it's not my usual route to anywhere. And immediately after the construction began and the overhead roadway came down, they said, your project is working. I was like, again, it's not my project. But I think it has demonstrated to drivers in the city that you don't need an overpass for connectivity and mobility to work for them, in the same way that I think the Washington Street corridor in Roslindale is showing people you don't need 2 lanes of cars to make it work, to not get stuck behind a bus. Something else solves that problem. And so I think this is potential for Allston, and I hope something like the Bowker overpass.
Yeah, which is, needs a little TLC. Tony, you want to go to People's Pike? Tamika, you had something you want to say?
I was going to tell my John Barrow story.
Yes.
So I moved to Boston in 2003 and lived in the Ashmont area. I knew Franklin Park, and I drive on the Casey overpass to get to Route 9 to go to school in Waltham. And one day I took the bus to Forest Hills, and I didn't realize that it was the same neighborhood. I thought the overpass was a highway. It didn't occur to me that I was driving over Jamaica Plain to get to Route 9. And I moved there as an adult, but again, because it was so disconnected, I thought Franklin Park was one neighborhood, and it didn't connect to JP. JP was separated by the overpass. So in this generation, one person has learned something different.
Jess, Tony, can you put the People's Pike up? Thanks, Tony. So there's a similar debate going on now about the Mass Pike. Well, you can describe it, the bridge there and that needs to be replaced and what the options are. Frame that a little bit for us. Like, what are the fault lines of this debate, and where do you, which you're very much involved in yourself, where do you hope this comes out? What's your goal here?
Sure. So I will try and explain a very complicated project very quickly. But I think this goes back also to some of the conversation we were having earlier about, how do you explain something to people versus how do you ask people what they need, and how does that conversation happen? And so this was a classic case of a state agency having one idea of what a project is for, and pretty much everyone else having a different idea of what it was for. Unlike the Casey overpass, this has been a case where there's been a really remarkable amount of consensus between local residents in surrounding communities, advocacy organizations like Livable Streets and Walk Boston, institutions like Harvard, and the Boston Globe, and pretty much everyone. And so MassDOT's idea of what the project is for is the Allston interchange, where you get off I-90 to go to either Allston or to Cambridge. Used to have toll plazas, but we now have automatic tolling, so they didn't need the toll plazas anymore. So there was an opportunity to make that highway a little bit more efficient and urban style instead of having the big looping off-ramps. And more importantly, or more urgently, there's a viaduct, so an elevated portion of the highway that goes between BU campus and the river in this very constrained cross-section. And that viaduct, as all viaducts do, like the Casey overpass, is falling down. And so that needed to be replaced in some fashion. So MassDOT's idea was this project is about replacing the viaduct and getting rid of the toll plazas. The community and Harvard and many other people had a different idea, which is that this project is a once-in-a-century opportunity to take a neighborhood that has been cut in half for more than 100 years, because before it was the Mass Pike, it was a big rail yard.
Yeah.
To take this community that's been cut in half and knit it back together and knit both halves better to the river. Because right now, if you're on the Esplanade, there are a bunch of different bridges, footbridges to get on and off in the Back Bay. And then once you get to BU, you're stuck for over a mile. And then you finally get to another point to get off, and you're at that terrible intersection by the Doubletree Hotel and Cambridge Street. And so while, BU campus and the Gap neighborhood of Allston and Lower Allston and all these other places where people live are very close physically to the river. In some cases, it's a very roundabout way to get there, or it's a very unpleasant and dangerous way to get there. And so reconnecting Allston was really one of the driving ideas from the neighborhood perspective and many of the advocacy organizations. And then the open space, the quality of that open space was another huge point, where currently that section of the river path is extremely narrow, and you're really sandwiched right next to the Storrow Drive traffic. And so we all wanted to think about, is this an opportunity? It should be an opportunity to rethink how the open space is designed at the river so that it can be a place for people to be in and not just hurry through as fast as they can.
Right. Alex, yeah. And yeah, Tony.
The drawing should be much wider, much elongated, because some of what you talked about actually is not here, but further to the, I guess, west, right? Can I just, absolutely. But let me offer another historical perspective. The Esplanade was created in response to the decision to widen Storrow Drive at the time when suburbanization began to draw people way out west. We shouldn't forget entirely that the greenway was a result of a widening of the central artery. So there's actually a history. It's not a happy history in that it usually involves years of fighting, but there's a history of transportation planning, oddly enough, ultimately leading to expansions of public space in the city of Boston. I can give you other examples as well. So the fight is a good one, and there have been similar fights in the past that ultimately have not overcome two nasty highways and so forth, but have also at least produced mitigation in terms of public space.
Right. Is there a little bit of a difference now when it might have in the past been mitigating the transportation project?
Right, yes.
Now as open space and
now
mobility
it becomes
are
more important
converging.
perhaps than the transportation.
Yeah, well, it's another form of transportation,
Yes,
right? This story in the Globe today surprised me a little bit about Longfellow Bridge, that the bike mode share on that bridge is huge in the morning. It's actually, was it 30%, something like that? The persons crossing that bridge in the morning commuting hour, 30% of them are on bikes. So it actually is a transportation option. It's not just about open space. So we need to wrap up here. We could go on a bit here, but we want to make time for audience questions. Before we turn it over to the audience, so be thinking of your stumper questions for our panel here. I want to ask each of you briefly to make a wish.
Make a wish?
It can be a project. It can be a change to process or funding or anything. Just make a wish for something that you think would advance this emerging world of connected open space.
I wish that getting intersections and connection points right the first time was the default. That the default was, it's really clear where to go next. The default was having a great crossing, the putting the pieces together. Because the fact that we're not only fighting for corridors, but that each little place that the paths connect is so often a problem, or so often is what we have to go back to. Like, that shouldn't be where we're fighting the fight.
We know enough now to get it right the first time. Yeah. Tamika.
In the same breath, I wish that resident engagement, or human engagement rather, is a default part of project processes, not the end, but the beginning, all throughout the phases, that we recognize residents as experts in their own neighborhoods. They live, sleep, and breathe there versus external folks. And that is just part of how we do business in urban spaces, in transit, in open spaces, that the average folk has a seat at the table to be involved in processes along the way. And that will inform, I think, a more colorful perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
to get off the stage soon, get to dinner. I wish we were bolder. I wish we were bolder. I really wish we were bolder. I think that too much of it now is about, as critical as it is, about hoping to get consensus around more bicycle paths, which is great. But I wish we were bolder, and I wish consensus around bolder ideas about open space. That's what brings us back to Olmsted. In a sense, it was easier then because there was less consensus requirements. But for example, what I said earlier about trying to get something other than lawns in front of office buildings, that would require a certain amount of boldness, both on our political leaders, but also on citizens as well, to kind of aim a little bit higher than they sometimes do.
Right.
So those would be my wishes.
Good. That's good. You can't go to dinner yet, though. We have some questions.
Yeah, I would say my wish would be, back to the I-90 project, but not just I-90, of course. But I think planners, and residents are often on the same page in thinking about things as multi-layered opportunities where a transportation project can also create new parkland, can also create new opportunities for housing, et cetera, But the way our government structures are set up is that all of those things are in different departments and they don't talk to each other. City governments are getting a lot better at working across those departments, but I think that's something that hasn't really started happening as much at the state level. And so my wish would be that we, for the I-90 project, we can think a little bit more, we can get the message across a little bit better about how it's an economic development project, it's an open space project, it's a public health project, it's all of these things, and it's not just we need to replace this viaduct that's falling down.
That would be part of the boldness, actually, yes.
That's great. Thanks, all of you. So we have. You going to take the mic? Yeah. Time for questions here.
Okay. I'm not sure who this is directed toward. I'm Scott Englander. And hundreds of years ago, in the great cities that we have today in Europe, for example, were designed hundreds of years ago when we knew how to do things. We knew that when buildings were designed, they were designed because of the way the effect they had on the space around them. We created great spaces through the design of the buildings. Today, we're still stuck in this sort of modernist, terrible mode of, the building is this iconic building that's designed by a starchitect, and there's very little thought to how that affects the public space and the public realm and connectivity next to it. Often we're able to push back and have an effect, but it's these skirmishes that happen on a project by project basis, and by then it's often too late to do anything. How do we think about instead of everything beyond the sidewalk being the developer's realm, and we're stuck with what's left between the curbs or between the edge of the sidewalk for creating greater connectivity and mobility and healthier spaces to be and to move. How do we break that down and think proactively and put in place optionality on that space? And for example, the Longwood Medical Area or the Fenway, these are great examples of where something could have happened, but it didn't because, of these divisions.
Yeah, I think there are some examples, not thinking super boldly, but I can just think of in Watertown, they had a greenway plan that sort of hit Arsenal Street, and there wasn't a good way to accommodate the greenway in Arsenal Street, and then it sort of popped out a few blocks later. And so what they did is, as those parcels are getting redeveloped, they're actually building the greenway as part of the private parcels. So it can be done. I mean, that's a pretty simple example where it's really just, they pushed the buildings an extra 10 feet back and made space for the bike path to continue. But that is where sort of the role of planning comes in, to say, this is the open space or the network connectivity that we want to have. so that when those opportunities come up and things are being redeveloped, you can be opportunistic.
To say something. First of all, I'd like to debunk the idea that there were good old days once before and now things suck. That's just a wrong way to think about things. But I will say that the transformation is going to, oddly enough, come as a consequence of climate change. I actually think that thinking about landscape, the landscape architecture profession, the issue of resilience is becoming substantially more important and will continue to become more important, and to some extent will sort of begin to kind of diminish the power of the private developer.
My name is John Buxton. I live in the Fenway, part of the board of the Fenway Civic Association and the Alliance of Downtown Civic Organizations. I have a wish. I wish that every time we had a project, we thought about the people who we were displacing. It's like a hospital saying, oh, the operation was a success, but the patient died. We're trying to make things better for the residents of Boston, but these residents can no longer afford to live here. And Chinatown right now is a perfect example of people being displaced at in very large numbers, where not only have they lost their house, but they lost their community, because that's where their social activity was, that's where their health was taken care of and their language was understood. And so my wish is that every time we have a project, we make sure we are not displacing the people who are trying to help.
My name's Karen D'Amato, and I was active in the campaign to save Prouty Garden at Children's Hospital, and I'm wondering if the panel has any lessons or suggestions for how to continue connecting healing gardens with green space and how to make those gardens something that belongs to the people or the children who are being treated, and those gardens could be an educational kind of link between the importance of nature and healing as well.
I want to say I hear you. We know that urban spaces, parks, open spaces rather, one of the benefits is social cohesion. So I know Healing Gardens does that and makes space for that. I'm not sure what could be done on a citywide scale. I think that's a space to explore. So I don't have an answer, but I do want to confirm and affirm that there is a space for social cohesion and just a space that folks have to go to. So you're right. Just not an answer per se.
I recognize that we've done a lot of talking about the bike network aspect of the Emerald Network tonight, and I think I want to acknowledge your point. Again, I don't know enough about your particular situation to speak to it, but I think that in the idea of creating networks of open space and networks of parks, one issue we've encountered in Boston, or that I'm aware of in Boston, is that some things are owned by DCR and some things are owned by the city, and sometimes things bleed into something that's owned by Public Works or the BPDA or BTD. And the idea that the public realm is seamless, that maybe you own a parcel that seems to have been used for one thing, but really in the 21st century, it needs to be a healing garden, or it needs to be a place with a fountain, or it needs to be a place that you put in public art. There isn't yet a sense that the whole public realm needs to work together and that all those spaces need to be allocated, and it might not be the individual department or state agency that controls it. I think that's something, maybe a part of my wish list is to really bring that cohesively together.
I have a question similar to Matt's Make-A-Wish question, so I hope it doesn't actually overlap too much. First, I have to say, though, that if we had seen, instead of the beautiful green plan of the Casey Overpass new incarnation, an aerial photograph at rush hour, we would all have a very different impression of the success of the Casey Overpass reconstruction, redevelopment. But my question for everyone is this. We were talking about Olmsted, and I always think of what a visionary he was when I hear his name, and this is a visionary idea, to the network. And I guess I have a question for I guess I can't think of anything like that that's going on now except maybe this. But I think it's because the city is so complex now that we have specialists in many different areas of progress in creating and connecting green spaces. So each of you, what would you consider the most visionary idea that you are familiar with right now in Boston in advancing your idea of improving the city?
So, it's a provocative question. It gets back a little bit to Alex's comment about how are we thinking big enough. And the Emerald Network doesn't do it for you in terms of being visionary?
No, I said it is.
I mean, to me, and of course, we're all a little bit invested in this. Everybody up here has been involved in this in some fashion or another in advancing this. The idea of a large change that happens incrementally. I mean, we all love the idea of big, bold things happening, and every now and again they do. They're usually driven by some kind of crisis, and maybe climate change will be that crisis as sea level rise. Otherwise, change tends to happen more incrementally. The land making that shaped Boston happened over 200 years. It wasn't, nobody came up with a mega plan to create the current outline of Boston. So I guess my answer to the question is a little bit of a counterpoint to say, yes, we need to think bigger, but planned incrementalism, having large plans that are accomplished step by step, incrementally as opportunities arise, it seems to me is where we are right now in our city. Maybe we could be thinking bigger, but I think that's sort of where we are.
Well, this is very, very valuable. I just wanted to hear from each of these people with different specialties what they think is.
Yeah, I think if I can actually have sort of a counterpoint to both of you, I think that the Greenway is an interesting example because I moved to Boston just as all of the Big Dig was getting finished up. And so for me, the Big Dig was a huge success because we got the Greenway and, I'm not biking under or walking or, having a beer at a beer garden under a giant highway overpass. I'm doing all of those things in a beautiful park. But we really, the Boston sort of zeitgeist really has still a hangover from that project. And we find it very, very hard to think big and to be willing to spend money on things because that project was, had so many challenges. And so I think that like the bold idea that we need is just thinking boldly in and of itself. I think that we so often, whenever anyone proposes a bold idea, it's just the immediate reaction is, oh, it's too expensive, oh, it's too difficult. And I think we really need to be willing to dream a little bit more and ask, how could we make it happen? Not why can't that happen?
I think that if you come back to Boston in 2100, you're going to see a greenway along the water that is going to be completely unlike the harbor walk that you experience today. I think like both of my more expert mentors here on this panel have suggested, climate change is creating new conversations, new demands. We have to respond to something different. And I'm not going to say how that's going to change. Like, I don't want to be quoted. I'm not the person with that vision, but I do expect that in the next 80 or so years, that incrementally we will be, the big announcement yesterday, if you missed it, was no harbor barrier. That's a bad idea. Please just look at the coastline. And so I think that coastline will continue to change, and it'll be a really, assuming Chapter 91 still says that there needs to be public access, that public access could be really cool and protective and do different things at different tidal levels, and that's where you'll see real change.
I think for me, I'm excited about just advocacy. And it's not so tangible, but the levels of advocacy in different kinds of spaces and across silos. So from architects and transit folks talking to residents, to public health, to housing, I think I'm starting to see this budding excitement and recognition that it's not a siloed type of planning process, but folks are seeing intersectionality of both the open spaces, but also people's lives and how transit and open spaces interact and how folks are seeing their city, imagine their cities for the future. So I'm pretty excited about how we, as Boston residents from different areas have been starting to work together, and I'm seeing some outcome there. So we're talking more and doing more together.
I think that the Emerald Network is a very bold idea, and the fact that it can be done incrementally will mean it will likely reach success over the course of a generation. But if I were to name my principal bold idea that I wish we had, overcoming the malaise of the Greenway, it would be the urban ring, circumferential transit system. That was the most important thing that I think that is missing, including partially solving the problem, this wedge of part of the city, and that you don't have to take a canteen to go from one part of the city to the other because you have to go through the downtown. That, I think, should be the next bold idea. And of course, it's only been 112 years since it was first proposed. Hopefully, some the younger ones in the panel should live long enough to see it happen.
That's tomorrow night.
Yeah, and I just can't resist making the plug that West Station, part of the I-90 project, is a crucial piece of that. So everyone write some letters to Secretary Pollack. West Station now, thank you.
Hi, I'm Herb Nolan, Executive Director with the Solomon Foundation, and I've been working with you all for years on greenways. So I'm a huge fan of greenways, interconnected networks. But there's a little sort of questioning in the back of my mind as I work on these projects, and especially now working in Mattapan, Hyde Park. How we're looking at a large scale, and we all bike, we all cover miles and miles of these trails. We're looking forward to that connectivity. But what about a huge proportion of the population that's not going to be up on the bike? It's not going to be going more than a half a mile from their home. Maybe they're little, maybe they're elderly, or maybe they're just not into doing the big network. How do we relate to them? How do we serve their needs? It sort of goes back to all politics is local. It has to work for the neighborhood, or you're not going to get the greenway to go through that neighborhood because they won't feel like it relates to them. So I'm sort of now thinking a lot more these days about placemaking, about reasons to go out there, that you might want to make that mile trek or might want to walk that half mile. Jessica and I have been working on an amphitheater along the Charles River. There's some opportunities along the Neponset. These are communities which have been sort of, in a way, bypassed. Even though we think we got the Neponset, it's done. They're neighborhoods that have really been bypassed by that wonderful greenway on the other side of the river. How do we serve their needs? So what's the role of placemaking, and how do you work at that smaller scale to make these greenways relate to the neighborhoods? That's my question.
So for those of you who don't know, there's an online tool that allows you to do park scores for different cities, just like there's a walk score. Everything's scored these days. And yesterday at a conference that Matt and I and Bud were all spent the day at, and Mira, we heard from Mitchell Silver, the Parks Commissioner in New York, who talked about how they have a really high park score. It's not as good as Boston or San Francisco, but he thinks that all of our park scores are skewed. The number of people who live near a park is measured, and it seems to be really high, but the quality of that park is not. And so I think it's actually a separate conversation for this, but hopefully all of us in this room who care about a network of paths also care that every neighborhood has not just a thing that is marked as a park on a map, but a place that is green and is welcoming and goes back kind of to that healing garden question, right? Like, what is available in every single neighborhood? It might not be connected by lines, but it might cover the map in something that isn't just green colored on the map, but like is a real good place.
Just really quickly, just thinking about integration, about how these spaces are used. So my colleague Vivian is here, and in Mattapan recently, a bike fix-it station was installed along the Neponset Greenway. There isn't a bike shop in Mattapan, so it makes sense on the Neponset Greenway to have a fix-it station. So now if I'm a resident in Mattapan, I have a greater incentive to use that space. It's integration, thinking about how people use spaces, what's missing, and how do I almost give an incentive for that space to be used because it's functional for my needs at the time, and then invites me to therefore take care of that space but also use the space as my own. So thinking of not either or, but integrating several services and functionality into open spaces.
And I live, by the way, right across the street from Forest Hills in Jamaica Plain. I just want to know, and by the way, that other lady was right about if you saw that green picture at rush hour, it's entirely different. Is there any completion date in sight? Does anybody know? And the other question, it's also kind of succinct. Is there any, is there a chance of having the Emerald Necklace continue from, like you said, from Forest Hills to Columbia Road out to the harbor? I mean, if there's any chance of that, I'd love to hear it, because that would be my dream, is to be able to go from, like you said, water to water. So is there any?
Casey Overpass follow-up question. So I'm not claiming cause and effect, but since the project has happened, we have luxury apartments and a microbrewery and lots of families that have been displaced. And that kind of thing, I think, is an unintentional result, oftentimes, of improved connectors and beautiful green spaces. So my question is, how does advocacy around more livable networks of connectors and green space address the likely gentrification results and give existing communities power over these spaces?
Jerry Wright. I've tried to understand Olmsted for 60 years, centered around Jamaica Pond. And I was disappointed, Alex, that you focused on a transportation question and your bold idea, whereas I think Olmsted wanted to reforest the islands. Olmsted was centered on trees. Olmsted was centered not only for the psychological reasons, but also, most importantly from my position, for philosophical reasons and the center point of democracy. And my question is it not that corporate America, and even through their support of private organizations, has lost the basic concept of Olmsted, which is it was the duty of the government to care for these precious lands that include beautiful scenery with trees as a cornerstone? And his statement he made about freedom was the fact that the most important gift for every person who walked into a park was a sense of enhanced freedom.
Whoever evaluates Casey years down the road, I hope they won't do it through a surgical drape just over that Forest Hills area and how much time you spend at a light versus a flyover, because urban overpasses, you're not landing on an expressway, you're landing on a street grid. And if you're heading inbound to the medical area, Riverway at Brookline Ave is one lane. You're going to spend 20 minutes at Brookline Ave. Flying over Forest Hills doesn't help you. So it's a big picture trade-off kind of thing. That said, I don't know how one could even answer this, but it's sort of salt in the wound for me when I hear the term complete the Emerald Necklace. I love the concept. I hope they do it. But when they do, the Emerald Necklace will not be a successful necklace until they fix some of the gaps in the historic park. So the overpass at Casey was not the only change that was made to accommodate cars. There are breaks in the bike network beyond Jamaica Pond up to Casey. There's a nasty crossing at Brookline Ave. There are places that just, I hope when you all talk about completing the Emerald Necklace, you'll talk about the new part, but also the old part. Thank you.
My name is Dan Thomas, and I'm an architect. I live in Jamaica Plain, but I'm not going to dwell on too many of those things. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is more that instead of having this be a network and a series of connectors, I'd like to dwell on the sense of place that you get, that the riverway shouldn't be the riverway, it should be the river, right? That we're not always trying to use these things as transportation modes, that the Jamaica Way is like a goat path that is treated as an expressway, and I think that it would be a good thing if we just found ways that were not linear, that they were places, that they were arrivals, they were places to be. The park is a place to be.
Interesting, thank you. So interesting series of questions. You all can take, so we have Casey Overpass was striking a nerve still. I'm not sure there's more to say on that, but somebody, if they want to. Columbia Road and the opportunity there to complete the necklace, but without losing sight of fixing the broken pieces of the historic necklace. The importance of placemaking, and not just parks as places to pass through or greenways as places to pass through, but places to stop. And then parks and open space as a kind of engine of community empowerment. Is there a way to do that? To have open space be a kind of anti-displacement measure. So who wants to take any of those?
I'll take the hardest one first. I think that, we could spend, 10 more panel discussions about gentrification, but I think the most important thing for me is that, there are definitely lots of forces at play, and by improving a neighborhood through either a transportation project or an open space project, it can attract new people, and it can, raise property values and make it harder for other people to stay. But that's not a reason not to improve a neighborhood. So what we have to do is figure out ways to still, create new open spaces and make it easier for people to access them, but without displacing them. So figuring out ways to involve all of those people in the process, but also to figure out ways that all of these different interconnected things that are happening, that we're not just sort of pushing one lever and then there's all these unintended consequences, but we're thinking about the entire thing and how that one lever will impact those other things and what other levers we're going to need to push to balance out.
You've already answered, but I wanted to offer a resource. There's a book called Contested Nature. It talks about biodiversity and social justice and has several examples from globally that speaks to how this is the nature of nature. So it does speak to how, a new marine park in the Caribbean, for example, causes more tourists and displaces others. But I think there are ways through social justice to recognize who has rights and whose birthright the space is, and then work with those communities to advocate on behalf of their spaces, but also give them permission to recognize that these improved spaces may also improve their own lives. So I think it's not either or, there is space for both things to happen at the same time.
I'm just going to say this is a conversation at the Boston Public Library. Most of you apparently lots of JP residents in the house. Most of you live in Boston, probably a few of you live in Cambridge or Brookline. This discussion, the Emerald Network, all fits into a much larger regional vision that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council has been working on called Landline. And that larger regional vision has greenways across the 101 cities and towns of MAPC. It's a place to recognize that all over Massachusetts, and in fact all over America, these are trends, right? The idea that we want to connect people, provide them access to open space and recreation, that we want people to have active transportation along these industrial spaces or whatever, and that we want it not just to be bike lanes, we want parks with a sense of place, we want a place where you can stop, you want benches there, you want programming, you want it to connect bigger parks. All of these things are part of a regional question, and it's not just happening in Boston where there's certainly a housing crunch. It's happening in lots of places, and so in some cases it comes hand in hand with gentrification, but I don't think that the Casey Arbor Way is as you acknowledged, probably not the cause of gentrification. It's just they're all happening simultaneously in this place, and so I think I guess I'm just saying, think regionally. This isn't just a question of what's happening on the Casey. It's a question of how we're linking parks across the region, both for people to recreate and to travel.
Just a sentence or two about this. For most of the 20th century, Americans were abandoning their cities, at least those who could afford to do so, which for a while meant a majority of the population. We're now experiencing a moment at which, and that had all kinds of consequences. All kinds of environmental consequences, all kinds of consequences. For the moment, that's reversing. For the moment, we're experiencing a kind of a pull back to the city. And of course, that also has consequences. I don't think any of us on this panel can solve gentrification, but I do think you have to understand that there's a kind of a transformation at the moment occurring in America, including great inequalities caused by all kinds of things other than park building. But part of it, in a case like Boston, Boston is, for the first time in over half a century, increasing its population. It's actually not just, rich plutocrats buying housing in the towers, right? Increasing its population for the first time in over 50 years. And that causes a certain amount of consternation, which we don't know how to solve yet, but certainly have to find ways to deal with. But the problem is not about little open spaces that do this. The problem is a kind of a national return of affection, actually, for the benefits of urban living, which is creating great pressures that were not necessarily foreseen.
Thanks everyone. So, and thank you all for coming and for a great discussion. I want to thank our panel also for a really rich discussion. If we've intrigued you about the Emerald Network, LivableStreets website has an Emerald Network feature. If you go to emeraldnetwork.info, you can sign up for a newsletter and see the vision map that you saw here. You can also see it in the exhibit if you go see the exhibit. LivableStreets is also, if you want to experience the network firsthand, LivableStreets is hosting a tour de streets on September 8th. There's more info on that on the website as well. Before we leave, I just want to acknowledge the really great work that Stacy Thompson from LivableStreets, the executive director, right here in the front row, does. Stacy, and Tony Lechuga, the Emerald Network project manager, and also my co-founder up on the top row there, Steve Miller, a longtime LivableStreets board member. And then just a final thanks to our panel for a really great discussion.